So we'll start by talking about mist and fog by putting some definitions down. What actually is mist and fog? Well, the Met Office says that it's obscurity in the surface layers of the atmosphere caused by a suspension of water droplets. Basically, we'll talk more about this as the course goes on, but fog is water vapor which is condensed within the atmosphere and formed small droplets. And significantly, rather than a cloud, which is what we'd call it if it was several thousand feet up, it's in the surface layers. It's down by the ground. So what is the difference between mist and fog? And the answer is functionally not very much. It is exactly the same stuff, but we're talking about density. And you might have noticed that we put the METAR codes there, BR for mist and FG for fog. And FG makes lots of sense, but you might reasonably question why BR for mist, and the answer, as is generally the case when it comes to aviation meteorology, is that it's down to the French, BR standing for brume, which is of course mist in French. Now, as far as the UK is concerned, mist is visibility that is greater than 1,000 metres but less than 5 kilometres. And in the UK only, the relative humidity also needs to be greater than 70%. Otherwise, it would be referred to as haze. In a more general sense, and certainly in an international sense, mist is wet, i.e. these suspension of water droplets in the surface layers of the atmosphere, whereas haze is generally caused by dry particles, for example, sand or dust or so on. Fog, on the other hand, therefore, is anything that is less than 1,000 metres. What's the difference between fog and cloud? Well, again, functionally, nothing at all. Exactly the same things. I suppose you could reasonably say that fog would be cloud that touches the ground, and from a practical point of view, the lowest height that cloud is reported at in an aviation weather report is 100 feet above the ground, so reasonably anything below that you could argue was fog. And so anything less than about 100 feet or so cloud. Anything less than 100 feet or so, you could argue, was fog. Different types of fog. As mentioned, all fog is formed when water vapour contained within the air condenses. It forms small droplets. In general terms, warm air can hold more moisture than cool air, so therefore if we cool the air to the point at which it can no longer hold the moisture it contains in vapour form, and there is a particular temperature to which that we cool the air, that will happen, that is referred to as the dew point. You've probably seen temperature and dew point in a METAR or a TAF at some point. Or the other way that we could form fog would be to add moisture to the air until it reaches saturation point. So there's lots of different ways in which we can cause that water vapor to condense, and the different ways in which that can happen we refer to is how we classify different types of fog. So radiation fog is what you're probably most aware of in the top left. On a cool, crisp morning in the UK. Advection fog, that picture is, I'm sure you're aware, I'm sure you recognise San Francisco and the Golden Gate Bridge. And San Francisco is famous for advection fog. We'll talk more about that as the course goes on. Evaporation fog, that steamy sort of mist that appears on cold lakes on a cold winter's day. So again, different method of formation. And if you do much VFR flying, if you have a look at the Met Office Form 215, you will almost certainly have seen at some point in there a mention of hill fog. And this is the sort of fog that forms on upslopes of hills and mountains and so on. So we'll be looking, as I say, in much more depth at these different types of fog, how they form, how to recognise and most importantly anticipate the conditions that are likely to lead to them forming as the course progresses. So what hazards are associated with fog and low visibility? Well, we can start with our flight operations safety plan, Wheel of Doom. And to be honest, low visibility encompasses quite a large proportion of our Wheel of Doom. So we can start with runway incursion, and this could be both our own aeroplane and other aircraft or vehicles. So the risk of an aircraft, a vehicle, or a person inadvertently entering an active runway increases as the visibility drops. It stands to reason if you can't see where you're going, you're more likely to blunder onto somewhere where you're not expecting. It's particularly a high risk at airfields where there are multiple runways or complex taxiway layouts, and that's fairly common sense, you would think. It's actually often the most difficult part of low visibility operations is getting around on the ground. Controlled flight into terrain. I mean, there is a whole catalogue of incidents involving people flying into obstructions or mountains or the ground in low visibility, because generally speaking, people don't tend to fly into mountains or obstacles or the ground when they can see them. There are, say, a whole catalogue of incidents involving aircraft that either inadvertently entered conditions of low visibility or diverged from a published instrument procedure below the minimum safe altitude. Collision, again, very few people have hit an aircraft or structure that they could see, and probably the most well-known, most famous example of collision occurring in low visibility would be the Tenerife disaster. I'm sure that if Captain Van Zanten had been able to see down the runway and see the Pan Am aircraft that was also on the runway in front of him, I'm sure he wouldn't have been so hasty to push the thrust levers up. That is the well-known famous example, but there are plenty of others as well, perhaps ending less dramatically. And runway excursion can be a factor on landing, particularly if we fail to properly make the transition from instrument references to visual references. You know, low decision heights haven't got a lot of time to transfer from looking in to looking out. The monitored approach can help with that, and there will be one example of that to come, and we'll talk more about some incidents in a few moments' time. Also a factor on takeoff, though, something to think about. If we have to reject at high speed, how much runway have we got left in front of us? And keeping straight also could be more of a challenge than sometimes we might think. So here's an image that you might be familiar with, a rather dramatic image of the evacuation after the Turkish Airlines Airbus A330 runway excursion after landing at Kathmandu in 2015. And lots of things to talk about that went wrong here, but this was a scheduled flight from Istanbul to Kathmandu, and actually they'd made the flight to Kathmandu, and at that time the visibility was below the limits, and so they held for about 40 minutes or so before they made an approach. They waited for the visibility to improve. It did, to around about 1,000 meters or so. Made one approach, went around, couldn't see anything, tried again about half an hour later, at the point at which they started this second approach. And one of the things which is particularly interesting and particularly valuable about as a learning point from this approach is the fact that visibility and fog can change very, very quickly. So at the point at which they started the second approach, the visibility was reported at 3,000 meters, quite a lot. As they continued down the approach, the visibility reduced very, very, very quickly. And Tao did ask if the crew had the runway in sight. The answer was negative. But as is a common theme in these sorts of accidents, the crew continued below the minimum descent altitude. There was no evidence that they ever had any visual references. Not only that, but this is quite astonishing, that the autopilot remained coupled all the way down to 14, that is 4 feet above the ground. In fact, the call that was made at the MDA by the captain, the first officer had called minimums. The captain's response was continue until 300 feet. And in fact, the first reference to the runway appearing was made 5 seconds prior to touchdown. When they did attempt to flare, the aeroplane was left of the centre line, the left main gear was off the runway, and the rest is history. There was a 2.7 G touchdown, caused the nose landing gear to collapse and all the damage that you can see here. It did turn out afterwards the FMS database position, bearing in mind this was an RNAV approach, not an ILS, so this was a database, FMC based approach. The position that was in the FMS database for the threshold wasn't quite in the right place, and this is one of the reasons why minima exist, because the segment below the minimum descent altitude is purely visual, or is meant to be purely visual. And as I say, very an example of how quickly conditions can change. The visibility at the start of the approach, 3,000 meters. By the time they had got to the point of touchdown, the visibility was described as well below minima. It actually changed in the course of, a few seconds. Fortunately, no serious injuries, but the aeroplane was, as you can probably imagine, written off. Another example, this time involving an ILS approach carried out with the visibility at the minimum that was required for this approach of 1,200 meters RVR. The captain involved was one of the airline's, Air India Express's 12 Czech pilots. He was a former military pilot, over 7,000 hours of experience. This was a very well trained, very experienced chap. In fact, he'd loaded plenty of fuel. He had enough for diversion to 2 alternates, not just one. And the approach itself was carried out perfectly normally and absolutely stable all the way down to the decision height, after which the autopilot was disconnected and the rate of descent increased slightly. The first officer actually called lights in sight just before the 100-foot radio call out, so quite significantly below the decision height. And it suggested that one of the reasons for the high rate of descent that was generated was the fact that the captain asked the first officer to look out for the lights, which would have distracted his attention from monitoring the instruments. And it's one example of where perhaps something like a monitored approach could have mitigated against this. Now, despite the damage, perhaps the most astonishing aspect of this particular incident is that despite all the damage, it was a landing of over 3 Gs in the undershoot, a 20-foot bounce, all 4 tyres needed replacement. But would you believe, neither the crew nor the ground engineer felt that they needed to report it. All that happened was the captain entered suspected hard landing into the tech log, which is just extraordinary, really, isn't it, when you think about it? So, how can we mitigate against this happening to us? And we can go back to our safety plan, Wheel of Doom. And we'll start with runway incursion. Well, I mean, there are ways in which we can mitigate against this. Equipment and technology is one of the reasons why we can now these days perform operations in very, very low visibilities. It would never have been possible in the past. Things like surface movement radar that enables ATC to track aircraft moving on the ground even if they're not visible from the tower. Low visibility procedures. When the weather goes below certain limits, airfields put these LVPs in place which protects the integrity of the localizer signal, something that we'll talk about a bit later in the course when we start talking about the ILS and the importance of making sure that the localizer is performing as we expect it to and as we need it to if we're going to perform things like auto lands. And taxi routes in particular, often, as we mentioned earlier, one of the most difficult aspects of low visibility operations, how we're going to get around on the ground safely. Controlled flight into terrain, again, most of this comes down to common sense and thinking about when we have a clearance below MSA. So the standard thing at BA now is that if you get a clearance below the minimum safe altitude, you have to justify why you're going to carry on flying below the MSA. Are we on a published instrument approach procedure or a SID? Can we see the terrain? Are we certain of our position relative to terrain or obstacles? Are we above the radar vectoring altitude? And if there's any doubt, then essentially we want to be getting out of there and climbing above the minimum safe altitude. Again, things like automation, not just monitoring it correctly, but making sure that we're using it appropriately and in the correct sense, and also adherence to procedures like minimums, decision heights, and minimum descent altitudes, as we've already talked about. Enormous factor in so many landing accidents. Collision, again, equipment on the ground like radar can help with this. Also equipment on the aeroplane like TCAS, RAS for runway incursions, and adhering again to the airfield low visibility procedures, which we'll talk about in much more detail as the course goes on. And runway excursion, again, things like on landing, and we'll talk more about this again in more depth as the course goes on, making sure that the autopilot performance and the auto land performance, the ILS performance, is what we need if we're going to perform an auto land, respecting minimum autopilot engagement heights. We heard about that earlier on in the Turkish incident at Kathmandu. Aircraft equipment can be useful in terms of helping us keep straight, particularly on the runway during a low visibility to takeoff or rejected takeoff. So things like the PVD, the paravisual display, which is on the PMDG 747 version 3, and also in real life we have that on the 767, the 747 and the 777, and we'll talk more about how we can use that later in the course. The heads up display, which is on the 787 as well, fulfills that function of giving us tracking information down the runway during takeoff in low visibility, and also just being aware of runway length awareness and takeoff and landing performance in particular. So we'll look at all of these areas and much more in more detail as the course progresses.